set? Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. My name is Pete Peterson. I want to give you first a review of our foundation and why we are supporting the project you're going to hear about today. Starting about 30 years ago, after studying the profound demographic trends and the vast and unfunded promises that we had made, I decided that our projected long-term, and I emphasize long-term debts, were not only unsustainable, but a primary threat to our future. Speaking of unsustainable, in the Nixon White House in which I served, Herb Stein was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and he used to say, if something's unsustainable, he said, it tends to stop. Or he said, if you don't like that, if your horse dies, I suggest you dismount. Well, I think we've been behaving as though we can ride this dead horse more or less indefinitely. In lieu of a quiet retirement and as a confirmed masochist, I decided to set up a nonpartisan foundation whose principal mission would be to increase awareness of the long-term debts and various solutions and try to get something done. Never, in my experience, have our fiscal security, our economic security, and our national security been more closely linked. Indeed, in the words of Admiral Mullen, the single greatest threat to our national security is our debt. We are endlessly reminded that everything must be on the table, including defense, which accounts for about 20%, as you probably know, of the budget. But defense doesn't really seem to be on the table in terms of widely discussed solutions or strategies. Instead, we confront sequestration, a thoroughly bad idea for getting a defense budget or any other budget. Unless we take action, we could face a fiscal or economic crisis that forces cuts to our military priorities, steep and arbitrary cuts that are neither coherent nor prioritized. The question is, can we and how do we achieve savings that can improve our fiscal outlook while meeting our national security needs? To quote Admiral Mullen again, he said, the Pentagon budget was basically doubled in the last decade, and in doubling, we have lost the ability to prioritize, to make hard decisions, to do tough analyses, to make trades. We also need a review of our defense strategy that makes sure that we are preparing for the threats and risks of the 21st century, not those of the past. The foundation has funded 2 efforts along these lines to help advance the best ideas for improving our defense strategy. Earlier this year, we funded a project by the Stimson Center, which brought together 15 defense experts to examine our strategic defense priorities in some detail and how they should be reformed. Today, we announced the new Coalition for Fiscal and National Security. The coalition, chaired by Admiral Mullen, includes senior national security, defense, and economic officials from both Republican and Democratic administrations, stretching back to more than 30 years, as well as leaders from the Congress, including some very distinguished gentlemen here today. All have served our nation with distinction, and they are joining together now to say very clearly that our leaders must find solutions to our long-term fiscal challenges because our nation's security depends on it. It's now my pleasure to introduce the chairman of the coalition. Admiral Mike Mullen's service as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff capped a very distinguished 43-year career in the United States Navy, including service as Chief of Naval Operations. While serving in the Navy, he also managed to obtain advanced management training at the Harvard Business School. Few have the combination of practical military experience and sharp budgeting and management knowledge that Admiral Mullen possesses. Respect for Mike Mullen is a major reason so many distinguished individuals chose to join this coalition. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Admiral Mike Mullen. Here he is. Good.
Thanks, Pete, and thanks for your leadership on this project, which, as you said, goes back decades. And I really do appreciate all of you coming here today at what is a truly critical juncture for our nation in terms of our national security, our economic viability, and our continuing leadership role overseas. It was in response to a reporter's routine question more than 2 years ago that I first linked these concerns. He asked me simply, what's the greatest threat to the United States national security? As chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I got asked that all the time. I answered in 2 words, our debt. I think I surprised him. Today, 15 former senior national security officials who served across 8 presidential administrations have formed a coalition to stress the need for elected officials to act. For not only has the passage of time exacerbated some of the economic problems, it has revealed a perhaps equally dangerous political one. Our inability to grapple with pressing fiscal challenges represents nothing less than a crisis in our democratic order, compounding the instability and unpredictability in a volatile world. Our propositions for this coalition are simple. The national security of the United States depends on its economic health. That health must be ensured by averting the immediate crises and by laying the groundwork for a rigorous long-term program of debt reduction, smart investment, economic growth, and lower income inequality. In national security spending, we can target investments much more efficiently in response to threats that are evolving before our eyes. And resources need to be shifted toward non-military elements of our national security posture. In the immediate term, and by that I mean over the next 4 weeks, we must avoid driving our country over the fiscal cliff. No partisan ideology is worth the cost to our nation, but just averting the disaster and kicking the can on the tough structural decisions needed to place our economy on a sound footing for the future is not enough. We are calling for a framework built out over the next 10 years to reduce the deficit and restructure fiscal policy, so as eventually to bring the budget into balance. This framework must include tax reforms to raise more revenue, encourage growth, and enhance progressivity. It must include parameters defining future levels of debt as a share of the GDP, and a date by which the budget will balance. And it must include changes to discretionary spending, entitlements, as well as defense. Our elected leaders should launch an expedited process to enact legislation that will construct this framework in 2013, including powerful but appropriate default and enforcement mechanisms. Without a recalibrated, sustainable fiscal policy, the United States' international standing will decline and its national security will be undermined. Such an outcome would be bad for the United States and, in our view, bad for the world. As Pete said, he and I are joined here today by three distinguished individuals, servants of America for decades, who made a difference, who had to come up with tough solutions to very complex problems. And it's been a real privilege for me to be with them in approaching what this coalition and those who aren't here today has brought together to try to inject some energy at the right place at the right time. So next up here will be Senator Sam Nunn, longstanding chairman in Senate Armed Services who understands our country and our national security as well or better than anyone I have ever worked with. Senator Nunn.
Well, first, thanks to Pete Peterson for getting this group together and for so much else that Pete and Michael and the Peterson Foundation have done in terms of bringing attention to the fiscal challenge we face and mobilizing support for a rational and sane fiscal policy. Second, Admiral Mullen, thank you for your tremendous leadership, both in the military and as a citizen in the recent months. You have led the way, and your statement that basically the biggest risk that we have to national security is our debt, and our unsustainable fiscal policy is one that I totally endorse and agree with, and I commend you for making it because your impact is very powerful. So that's really my first point. My second point is that even if we avoid the short-term debt crisis, the so-called cliff, and I hope that we will, the interest on debt in the years to come will increasingly dominate the budget and pressure defense in a very serious way. So without addressing a long-term 10-year solution, as Admiral Mullen outlined, the defense budget is going to be under increasing pressure. That is inevitable, and of course the interest rates have not even started going up, which is also inevitable at some point. Third point I want to make is that the problems within the internal defense budget and the dynamics of the internal defense budget also make the problem more difficult and more complicated, and also require a longer term to address some of these costs. First of all, the rising health care costs, second, retirement costs, and third, procurement inefficiency. Each of those has its own individual complexities, but all are enormously important. So the budget within defense is going to have to be addressed, even if the top line is one that is a rational top line. In other words, we have entitlements within the defense budget now which are comparable to the entitlements that all of us know that we've got to deal with outside the defense budget. My fourth point is that the debt and the fiscal picture make diplomacy and development in very poor countries of the world, as well as what Bill Perry has for years called preventive defense, makes all of those more difficult and less feasible, and thereby increases America's risk and increases global instability, because we are not in a position to do things that we otherwise would be in a position to do in terms of shaping the environment to prevent war. So in my view, America's fiscal picture increases the risk of conflict around the globe. Maybe not always involving the U.S., but certainly the risks are increasing globally based on our fiscal picture. The fifth point I would want to make is that the budget deal requires us to deal with the full deck of cards. And those people who keep wanting to take things off the table, in my view, are not being rational in terms of addition and subtraction. And when I say a full deck of cards, that includes defense participating in deficit reduction. It cannot be, in the case of defense, a sledgehammer approach. It's going to take a long runway dealing with these issues over time. If you give the Defense Department time, and they can make, in my view, very significant changes in the budget, but do it in a way that does not damage our security. Doing it abruptly, as the fiscal cliff does, or doing it in a very compressed time frame is not only inefficient, I think it endangers our security and our risk. My final point is that the missing element in this town is primarily political will, and I say that in regard to both political parties, and the solution that has to be forthcoming in the weeks ahead and the months ahead will require our leaders to, first of all, put our nation first. That has got to be the primary focus of our political leadership, to put the interest of our country first. So thank you, Pete, for your leadership. Thank you, Admiral Mullen, and it's also a great pleasure for me to be here with John Warner and Ike Skelton, two individuals I have enormous respect for And I'm not sure that my role is to introduce either one of them, but John, are you next or is Ike next? Ike's next. Well, Ike, it's a great pleasure to be here with you. Ike Skelton.
Thank you, Sam. Peterson, thank you for your vision in putting this effort together. You could not have a better chairman than Admiral Mike Mullen, and his leadership in the past has been outstanding, and it will continue to be outstanding through this effort. The late Barbara Tuchman, historian, author, once wrote a book entitled March of Folly, where she talked about how certain countries took action and measures that were contrary to the interest of their own country. I think that we are close to writing another chapter for Barbara Tuchman's book, should we go into sequestration and not have this challenge before us settled and settled properly. I have spent some 34 years in Congress. I have worked well with the gentleman on the stage, and I can tell you good stories, positive stories about Sam Nunn and John Warner and how we worked out some very difficult issues, but we got them done. I think Sam's absolutely right that it's a matter of political will. Let me say that the alternative of not producing a solution to this debt crisis, this so-called fiscal cliff, could bring about the sequestration, that is the slicing of the military right in half. That would be a disaster in many respects. Across the world, people would see we can't handle our own country well, that our own defense well. People across the world would see us failing to fulfill the duty of the Constitution to provide for the national defense. And it's up to Congress to do that. But after we get this done, and let's hope that it does come to pass, a second challenge is out there, and that's the challenge to glue together a strategy that will keep this country safe and secure. Back in the 1947 era, George Kennan sent what's known as the long telegram from Moscow to the White House, spelling out the rise of the Soviet Union and its intentions. President Truman, my fellow Missourian, and his staff glued together the containment strategy which stayed in effect through through General Eisenhower's presidency and later, until, as you know, the wall in Berlin came tumbling down and the Soviet Union imploded on itself. The strategy worked. After we get this solved, it's important that we glue together a national strategy. It's going to be different. There's not one single threat out there, but many. Terrorism, force upon force, state against state challenges, and that's what we must do. And we must nurture those in the war colleges and in the State Department who have that strategic vision, that ability to glue together a good strategy and make sure that it does come to pass. So I am hopeful we can solve the problem, that the Congress can come together as we did for many, many years in tough, difficult choices. And if you watch the comedians from time to time, you will see Larry the Cable Guy. And let me take a phrase from him to the Congress. get her done. Thank you.
I remember giving a graduation speech one day, walking down the aisle, and a little graduate pressed a little note in my hand. So I read it during the invocation. It was a very brilliant piece of wisdom. It said, "Blessed are ye that are brief, for you shall be re-invited." So I'm going to be brief, colleagues. You've all handled it very well, but I've got a short message. First, to my really friend of decades, Pete Peterson. You exemplify those in this country who have been given the privilege to rise to economic strength and material means, and now you're paying back to your country what it did for you. And Admiral, you and I have been by each other's side for many a years. I can recall when you first became Rear Admiral. And you have served your nation, and thank you for stepping up to take this on with Pete Peterson. To my colleagues, my old sidekick, Sam and I were chairman. He was the chairman, I was ranking for years. Ike was in there, and we were drilled in the school that our leaders told us, you got a problem, Mr. Chairman, or ranking member, go solve it. Do not bring it back to me. And we went into those conferences on that defense bill day after day and night after night. And it wasn't until we reconciled the difference between the leadership of both the House and the Senate. And then we presented the majority leader and the rank of the deputy, whatever, in both houses, a bill, and got it done. That seems to be lacking today, and I want to talk a little bit about that one point. They have stressed the importance of defense, and I wish to associate myself with your words about we cannot take a sledgehammer. We can reduce it, but we've got to reduce our defense spending somewhat gradually, but it should and will take its share of the cuts. But it has to be done very carefully because, as Ike pointed out, we live in a global society. We are the only real major superpower. And what we do affects the whole world. So this problem that we have is not just for the citizens of this country. It is affecting the livelihood, the ability of citizens all over the world, rich and poor, and of all faiths. So that's a heavy responsibility that's on our president and the Congress. But under the framework of our Constitution, we have to come together, the two branches of government, resolve our differences for the betterment of all. One thing about every single member of Congress, they raised their hand and said to support the Constitution of the United States. And I'm just going to, in a very simplified way, read the preamble, which says it all. And if we're to remove the uncertainty, that is the most insidious problem we have today. The uncertainty that this great republic can and will govern itself, and in that way help the world. We got to go back to this, which every member used to carry in his pocket. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, so forth, tranquility, provide for the common defense. That's what we're talking about. Providing for the common defense in a careful, measured way. And secondly, promote the general welfare. It's not just the welfare of the haves or the have-nots, it's the general welfare of all citizens of this country, and secure the blessings of liberty under this Constitution. Members ought to simply read that and say to themselves, well, what can I do? Well, our press release says they should communicate with the people. But I'd like to pose a challenge, because here assembled, and I thank you, each of you, for coming, are the people that hold the levers of communication. And we've only got a short period of time to communicate. And I think we should communicate to those people who are benefiting the most in this country from their economic status. That status having been achieved in a large measure by many years of hard work, sweat, toil, and taking risk. But now is your chance, individually and collectively, to step up and communicate with your members of Congress, the major donors to each of the members and others, those who benefit the most, to have the most at stake by what we call the working with the transfer and update of our tax structure. Communicate now like you've never communicated before with your member of Congress. Your letter, your communication, however you choose to do it, particularly if you're one of the major donors, will have an impact on that member. They need to know that back home, their support will support them again if they seek re-election. It's as simple as that. As Sam, Ike, and others said, it's courage. And by so doing, we remove the question of whether or not this great republic, which happens to be the oldest, longest, continuously operating democratic form of government today, can continue to roll on. That's what's at stake, and we've got to remove that uncertainty and show we understand under the Constitution what governance means. Let's govern. Now we'll take the questions. Thank you.
So happy to take questions.
Yes, sir. My question involves whether or not you believe that the American people clearly understand what's at stake. We've tended to not focus, I don't believe, with adequate pressure and clarity on what will happen if we continue. I've only seen one study myself of the various options for how the economy will react if, for example, we go to the window to raise more money and simply fail, or fail without a sharp increase in interest rates. That would be one scenario. Another scenario would be the repeat of the Suez Canal crisis, where I guess it was our own President Eisenhower who informed Anthony Eden that if they didn't pull their troops out of Suez when they landed to take it over from the nationalization by Nasser, we wouldn't roll over their debt. They left. I'm just not sure as I go from seminar to seminar, the Fix the Debt this morning, for example, there was no one sitting there like yourself or someone else that says, I am the person who represents the debt, the negative cost of no decisions, the negative cost, or the costs always are negative, the cost of continuing where we're going. Have we adequately communicated that to the American people, that it's not just an individual's re-elections that's at stake, it's jobs at stake? We could see another recurrence of 2008 and 9 very easily with an order of magnitude greater. We could see a recurrence of the energy crisis where I first met Mr. Peterson when he was Secretary of Commerce, which completely blindsided the government. What can we do to get this out in a clear way that's convincing?
Well, you want to make a couple comments?
Well, you're the chairman, but this is a subject I've thought a bit about. I tend to think of two possible crises. One is a short to medium term crisis, in which, as we experienced partly at the time of the debt limit debacle and the super committee debacle, financial markets lose confidence in our country, and you have a European or a mini European style crisis. That's the short term, at which point it's very hard to get money, interest rates go up, and so forth. But even in the best case, if we don't take action, you have a long-term growth crisis. Why do I say that? What does it take for us to grow? It takes investment in the future. It takes investment in plant and equipment, and R&D, and science education, and infrastructure, and so forth. The question many people, sir, don't want to consider is, where do we get those resources with those enormous debts? I asked our research department if they would make a reasonable prediction of how important interest costs would be if we did nothing. And their estimate, without any explosion in interest rates, was as follows. Within 25 years or so, our interest costs would jump from about 1% of the GDP to 12% of the GDP, or roughly 4 times the total investment made in R&D, science, education, and infrastructure. And if we ever permit that to happen, we will have assured that we're going to have what I call a slow growth crisis. And that's at least my way of formulating what happens if we don't do anything. But Mike, please take over. This is your meeting, not mine.
Well, one of the things I don't claim to be here as an economics expert, although it's from a national security standpoint, and I've felt this way for years, that it's not just about the health of our economy. It's around the world. It's the health of economies that generate positive outcomes, and the opposite is true as well. And from the defense standpoint, I think as Senator Nunn pointed out, I mean, if the debt continues to grow, it's just going to continue to eat at us. And when you put in the kind of time bombs that sequestration is, at least that was the intent, it was supposed to be so heinous that Congress would never permit it to happen. And yet we're on the verge of it happening. And for a force that has been fighting for over the last decade and is stretched and stressed at a time when there is clearly increasing pressure on the defense budget, and I'm one that has said for a long time that defense ought to pay its fair share. But what I worry about in terms of immediate impact, and maybe I think to get to a part of your question, do people understand this? I worry about the acceleration that going over that cliff creates to create a hollow force very rapidly. I mean, we're halfway through the fiscal year, so half of the money is gone. If the president does what he says he's going to do, he takes the personnel accounts off the books, if you will, from a standpoint of any cuts at this particular point in time. So you have the totality of the cuts focused on a very small percentage of the budget. And that gets into operations and training and maintenance and the kinds of things that really short-suit ourselves in the near term. But just like Pete, and I think Senator Nunn said the same thing, I've been concerned for a long time that we get our heads up and look at have a long-term strategy here. In being involved in this project, one of the things that struck me was at the end of World War II, and as we started to grow at some point, you know, the percent of the global GDP that the United States was huge. That's no longer the case, obviously, because we have many other growing economies and I think opportunities in a world that is so interlinked. And I've been around the world in many places that are asking questions about the United States and where we are going. I would hope, and maybe it takes a crisis like this to focus the minds of all Americans that this must be resolved. Certainly, it seemed as if it was a very important issue during the election, which involved an awful lot of the American population. I would just hope that that emphasis and that focus would bring a solution set both for the near term as well as the long term. The longer term, if debt keeps increasing, I mean, basically the Pentagon budget, the national security budget, just gets smaller and smaller, and we are becoming more and more unable to carry out the requirements that exist for us as a national security team, not just the Pentagon, but the State Department, and more other parts of our government who are involved in national security.
Hi, Kate Brannon from Politico. I was wondering if there's consensus among the group about the size of additional defense cuts that the Pentagon can weather. And a second question is, how will we know whether they've merely kicked the can down the road or whether they've laid the groundwork for a larger deal in 2013? What will those two look like, I guess? Thanks.
I think there is, the Pentagon has taken approximately in the 12 and 13 budgets, assuming the 13 budget goes into effect, about $900 billion out. And I think there is consensus in terms of what Senators Warner and Nunn have said, which is we need to do this over an extended period of time in a way that has a gradual enough slope so that the Pentagon can actually plan for the future. If we take out another $500 billion, which is what's tied up in sequestration, and the way as I understand anyway, the way the law requires the cuts to be taken, it really is an axe right at the middle, which will be very difficult to do in any kind of smooth way. So I'm confident that, with a little longer term view, the Pentagon can be fine. And one of the things that the group agrees on is that both with that time and where we are in terms of our overall requirements in a changing world, the advancement of technology, the quality of the people we have, and they're the best I've seen in over 43 years of having the privilege to wear the uniform, that the Pentagon, that we will be fine from a defense standpoint. But I also would pick up on what Senator Nunn said, quoting Bill Perry, and I've seen this in countries and in regions globally where in the failure to be able to invest in preventative defense, engagement, having a relationship, helping other militaries train in their own countries, the not being able to do that just increases the likelihood of some kind of conflict breaking out, which may or may not involve us. And that preventative piece is one of the first pieces that leaves under this kind of pressure. I do think that with, if this is well done, creating a framework that the national security team moving forward can put something in place which will address the needs specifically and can be done in 2013. I think falling off the cliff makes it very, very difficult.
I've often said that I'm an example of having humbly served in uniform twice, no great consequence. But I've seen this defense structure since the closing year of World War II to today, and 30 years in the Senate and 5 years in the Navy Secretariat. You cannot break defense and expect to glue it back together the next day. It has to. It's like a mighty ship moving. It can be break down slowly and carefully, and it can work more efficiently. We recognize this. But it is not something you can break and then fix, because people are what support it. It's the young men and women of the all-volunteer force. World War II, I volunteered, but many of them were draftees, and the draft stayed on. We don't want to go back to that. But we don't go back to it because there's sufficient numbers that will step forward and volunteer. And if they see their country beginning to let defense crack and not be an organization they won't join, they're not likely to join in the numbers or the quality that we need. So never before in history, in my time, have I seen more urgency for the citizens to communicate with the Congress. Not the Congress just talking, the citizen. It's a clarion call, I hope you put in your message, that now is the time for them to speak directly to their members and urge them to avoid the sequestration.
Yes, sir.
Bob Samuels, is this working? Bob Samuels in the Washington Post. This is for Admiral Mullen. I think the proposals of the administration are to reduce the Marine Corps by 20,000 and the Army by 80,000 from their peaks. And there's much speculation that further cuts in the Pentagon budget would lead to additional cuts in the both the Army and the Marines. If the United States was put in a position where it had to occupy and protect the oil fields of the Persian Gulf for an extended period of time, say 5, 6 years. Are those forces adequate to do the job?
One of the reasons at least I was able to get through the tour as chairman is try not to speculate too much on hypotheticals. The reductions in both the Army and the Marine Corps have been in the budget now. I think they're in the 13 budget. So basically, they've been on the Hill. The beginnings of them, they've been on the Hill for the better part of a year, and they are reductions both the chiefs of those two services and the chairman all support. Clearly, and I did as well when I was chairman over a year ago, that there was a need to come down. There was an expectation to do that as we move from what was a couple of years ago 2 wars to now the war in Afghanistan, where today we still have over 60,000 troops deployed, and as we move to come out of that war over the next couple of years. I think, I guess, based on what or as I said before, to look to the future, the Pentagon spends a lot of time looking at contingencies or possibilities in terms of planning. There is a view that it would probably, and I am of this, it would probably need to be a very high bar to put a significant number of troops on the ground in some country. That said, I'm also one that can go back the last 25 or 30 years and say that our ability to predict what we're going to do and where we're going to do it, our batting average is pretty close to 0. So that gets back to this got to be done very carefully. Those troop reductions are not going to happen overnight. And again, if there's a strategy that looks out long term and the Pentagon has a chance to meet that, then I think that contingencies, whatever they might be, will be able to be met. I have great confidence in our men and women and in the leaders who lead those services as well.
Rich Miller, Bloomberg. Given the possibility that some sort of action may be necessary against Iran and in the Middle East next year, does that argue for getting this thing to, putting this thing on a sound footing now, rather than having it sort of, hanging over us? You came out and you said, especially kicking the can down the road is kind of not a real viable strategy. What may or may not happen in Iran sort of add to that argument?
Well, I think, clearly the uncertainty that's out there with respect to Iran as well as other parts of the world is something that's very, very real. In most of, or certainly what I have tried to counsel on over time is to do all we can to make sure we don't have another conflict break out in the Middle East. That said, the economic impacts, global economic impacts of another war in that part of the world they're pretty draconian. Although we can respond, we've certainly focused on this for a number of years, and so I think your premise of, I think us being on a stable, solid footing as rapidly as possible is the key thing, and that will affect, should we get there, that will affect in a positive way our ability to respond to the uncertainty, as opposed to the opposite. If we're unable to get on a solid footing and we keep eating at our security resources, that certainly creates a totally different possibility, most of which is significant downside.
Dion Nissenbaum with the Wall Street Journal. This is for Admiral Mullen and any of the others you'd like to respond. Can you offer any more detail on exactly what you mean by saying that we can do more with less? Are you thinking of a strategy for defense that relies more on drones and special operations forces? Does it mean not making the pivot to Asia with the kinds of forces we're talking about? What kind of meat on the bone are we talking about here? Is there going to be a new kind of containment strategy you hope to put forth as this new coalition? Where exactly are you headed?
Well, I think I've been one that has, and I've been involved in the budget world a lot in my career, but I have worked hard to stay away from that very simple but I think misleading phrase, do more with less. That's just counting dollars. I think, with leadership focused on where the dollars are going, and as Senator Nunn said, more effective and efficient, getting our arms around the procurement costs. The costs of healthcare in the Pentagon they have grown at an enormous rate, and they continue to grow, as has been the case in the country. Those healthcare costs in the Pentagon, which are significant for our personnel, are unsustainable. So, and that too is going to have to be, we are going to have to figure out how to temper them in a way that both meet the needs of our people, but also recognize there are limits. So it's the totality of that, I think, that is really out there and I know that, as I did when I was there, and the leaders, General Dempsey and others, are very heavily focused on this right now, on how to do this. Mr. Peterson spoke of comments I made a couple of years ago, which is our budget has doubled, and in that, and in the crises of war, and an awful lot of focus there, we did not have to prioritize. We didn't have to make the hard decisions that many of us had to make in the 90s. We lost our analytical underpinning. Well, that's all coming back to bear on the current problem, and I think if we do that well, my point is that we can spend less and actually meet the requirements, whether they are unilateral requirements just for the United States to protect our vital interests, or requirements that we address with other partners throughout the world. Okay, we have time for no more questions.
We thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Admiral Mullen.